Hello, my name is Raul Cuevas, and this is my journal summary presentation for research methods in criminal justice. Throughout this course, we have looked at different types of research and how they can be used in criminal justice. For this presentation, I'm going to focus on traffic enforcement and whether the research supports the idea that discriminatory practices are taking place. I am also going to look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of the research methods and talk about police discretion and whether I believe it should continue to be used. When looking at traffic enforcement, I think it is important not to automatically jump to a conclusion either way. If the research shows that one group is stopped, searched, or cited more than another group, we have to look deeper into why that's happening. There could be discrimination involved, but there could also be other factors that affect those numbers. That's why the research method is so important. We have to look at how the information was collected, what was actually measured, and what other variables could have affected the results before we can say what the research really shows. Chapter 1 and 2 set the foundation for the rest of the course. One of the biggest things I took from these chapters is that we shouldn't just assume something is true because of what we personally experienced or because that's what we've always been told. When we're looking at something like discrimination and traffic enforcement, we have to separate our personal opinions and experiences from the actual evidence. We also have to consider different explanations for what we're seeing instead of just going with the first conclusion that comes to mind. That's where research becomes important because it gives us a better way of looking at the facts before making a judgment. Chapter 3 focuses on ethics in criminal justice research. When researching something like discrimination and traffic enforcement, I think being objective is extremely important because this can be a controversial topic and people may already have strong opinions about it. Researchers have to make sure their personal beliefs don't influence how they collect or interpret the data. They also have to protect the privacy of the people involved. The goal should be to conduct the research ethically and let the evidence guide the findings instead of trying to make the research support a certain position. Chapter 4 and 5 made me think more about how difficult it could actually be to measure discrimination. For example, if one racial group is stopped more often than another, that shows a difference in numbers, but it doesn't automatically tell us why that difference exists. Researchers have to clearly define what they're measuring and consider other variables that could affect the results. The location, reason for the stop, time of the day, enforcement activity, and other circumstances could also potentially matter. If those things aren't measured correctly, it could affect the conclusion of the study. Chapter 6 dealt with measuring crime, and one thing I've learned is that statistics can be useful, but they don't always tell the entire story. We saw that when I worked with the UCR data earlier in the course. The numbers allowed me to compare crime rates, but there were also limitations in what those numbers could tell me. I think the same idea applies to traffic enforcement data. The numbers can show us patterns and differences, but we still have to understand how the data were collected and what might be missing before deciding what those numbers actually mean. Chapter 7 focus on experimental and quasi-experimental research. These methods can help researchers get closer to determining whether one factor is actually affecting another instead of just showing that two things are related. The challenge with traffic enforcement is that it happens in the real world, where researchers can't control every variable. Every traffic stop can involve different circumstances. Because of that, I think researchers have to be careful about claiming that one particular factor caused an outcome when there may be other explanations. Chapter 8 and 9 focus on sampling and survey research. This is important because the people or traffic stops included in a study can have a major effect on the results. For example, studying one city or one police department doesn't necessarily mean those findings represent every department across the country. Surveys can also be useful for learning about people's experiences and opinions, but the way questions are asked can influence the answers. So before generalizing the results, we have to look closely at who was actually included in the research and how the information was collected. Chapter 11 and 12 give us additional ways to study traffic enforcement. Field observation would let researchers observe traffic stops and officer behavior directly. Rather than relying only on statistics, agency records and secondary data can also provide much more information about stops and their outcomes. I think using different sources together would give researchers a better overall picture. If the same pattern continues to appear across observations, agency records, surveys, and other data, the findings will be stronger than if they relied only on one source. Throughout the course, we learned that there are several different ways researchers can study traffic enforcement. Quantitative research can identify patterns in things like traffic stops, searches, citations, and outcomes. Qualitative research and field observations can provide more detail about what is actually happening during the traffic stop. Surveys can also be used to get information about people's experience and perceptions. Agency records and secondary data allow researchers to analyze information that has already been collected. I don't think one method by itself gives the complete answer. Using different methods and comparing the results can give us a much better picture of what is actually happening. Overall, I think the research methods we learned about are appropriate, but every method has limitations. Traffic stop data can show patterns across thousands of stops, which is something we couldn't get just from observations or interviews. The problem is that the numbers may not explain everything that happened during each individual stop. Surveys can provide more information about people's experiences, but those answers are based on people's memories and perceptions. I think the strongest approach would be to combine methods instead of relying only on one. If agency data, surveys, and actual observations are showing similar results, I would have more confidence in the findings. Validity and reliability are extremely important when looking at this type of research. For validity, I think one of the biggest questions is whether the study is actually measuring discrimination or just identifying a difference between groups. Researchers also have to consider other explanations and variables that could affect the results. Reliability is more about consistency. Were traffic stops recorded the same way? Were the same definitions used throughout the study? If another researcher used the same methods, would they get these similar results? If the data aren't valid and reliable, then it's difficult to make a strong conclusion from the findings. Another issue is whether the research can be generalized to a larger population. If a study only looks at one city or one police department, I don't think we can automatically say the results represent every law enforcement agency in the country. Communities have different populations, crime problems, traffic patterns, policies, and enforcement strategies. The sample also has to represent the population we're trying to make conclusions about. One of the biggest things I've learned from this course is how difficult criminal justice research actually is. There are a lot of variables involved, and researchers have to be careful not to make a broader conclusion than their research actually supports. I believe discretion is necessary in law enforcement. Every traffic stop is different, and officers must consider the totality of the circumstance before deciding what action to take. For example, a warning may be more appropriate than a citation. At the same time, I understand why discretion becomes important when we're researching discrimination. Two people committing similar violations could receive different outcomes. Researchers then have to determine why those decisions were different and whether the difference was based on legitimate circumstance or something that shouldn't have influenced the decision. After everything we covered throughout this course and from my own personal experience, I don't believe police discretion should be abolished. Law enforcement faces too many different situations to create a policy that tells an officer exactly what to do in every circumstance. However, discretion also needs accountability. If research identifies a pattern in which certain groups are treated differently, I think that pattern needs to be examined instead of ignored. At the same time, I don't think a difference in the numbers by itself automatically proves discrimination. We have to look at the research methods, the variables, the circumstances surrounding the stops, and other possible explanations. If those factors are accounted for and disparity continues, then the evidence becomes much stronger. The biggest thing I learned from this course is that we shouldn't start with the conclusion we want. We should start with a question and let good research and evidence lead us to the conclusion. I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation. This next slide is some of the references that I found.